Draw my attention. Yes, and it looked. He's 90. So,
City. It's amazing. Sure, he was living in New York, short finger. Oh, there's there. That was
Yes, we love doing cards.
We love doing cards.
We just started
We practice doing the chess cards. Sessions.
Oh, wow.
We love practice.
You really will. Is that because you're really into Ginsburg or I'm setting it up for there? That part of the year? Oh, you're going online or something? What does Naruto stand for? Is that a Buddhist term or something?
Oh, okay.
and welcome everyone. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events here at the Mechanics Institute. Thank you for joining us here for our program, Best Minds, How Allen Ginsberg Made Revolutionary Poetry from Madness, with author Stevan Weine. I'd like to say a special thanks to Mechanics Institute trustee Laura Hamady for recommending Stevan and his wonderful new book. Also, I'd like to introduce our new interim director, Avi Rose. Our conversation and talk today will be followed by a Q&A with you, our audience. And also, after our program, we will have Stevan's book available for you to purchase, and please have your book signed. Allen Ginsberg's 1956 poem, Howl, opens with one of the most resonant phrases in modern poetry. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. 30 years later, Ginsberg entrusted a Columbia University medical student with materials not shared with anyone else, including psychiatric records that documented how he and his mother, Naomi Ginsberg, struggled with mental illness. That student was Dr. Stevan L. Weine. Dr. Weine provides a groundbreaking exploration of the poet and his creative process, especially in relationship to madness. Dr. Stevan Weine is professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois College of Medicine, where he is also the director of global medicine and director of the Center for Global Health. He is the author of 2 books, When History is a Nightmare, Lives and Memories of Ethnic Cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Testimony and Catastrophe, narrating the traumas of political violence, 2 very potent themes for today. So please welcome Dr. Stevan Weine.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming. It's really great to be here. I'm going to talk for somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to show you some images, and I'm going to take you through some parts of the book. And then I look forward to dialogue afterwards. So I try to get close to a mystery, to the mystery of how poetry is made, how Allen Ginsberg's poetry is made, how poetry is made from really difficult life experiences. And one place you got to start with Ginsberg is you got to start with his 1948 Blake visions. If you know anything about Ginsberg, you know about this because he always talked about it. And here's what he often said: heard a very deep earthen gray voice in the room, which I immediately assumed, I didn't think twice, was Blake's voice. A very deep earthen gray voice. I immediately assumed, I didn't think twice, was Blake's voice. And this comes from an interview that he did in 1965 with a guy named Tom Clark, which is printed in the Paris Review. And all of the biographies written about Allen and most of the critical writings written about Allen cite this. Okay? And it's kind of foundational for everybody's understanding of Allen. Well, I was at his place a long time ago, 1986, and so it's like 40 years after the visions, or almost 40 years ago from now. And I'm going to read you a little bit from the book where I'm talking about that. So when I meet Alan 40 years later, the visions remain for him a key life event and a major focal point. The visions have been trumpeted by him and others writing about him as the moment when Allen Ginsberg first broke through. Given that Allen's personal breakthrough also became an important literary and cultural breakthrough, the visions have received much attention over the years. They were the focus of one lengthy published interview from 1965 that's often quoted, and several other writings. So before we meet, Alan asks me to first read each of those interviews, especially the one from the Paris Review, before he will speak with me about the visions. I cannot blame him. I figure he's tired of repeating himself. He also doesn't want me to subject his visions to a reductionistic psychiatric formulation. He doesn't want me to dismiss them as hallucinations, mere symptoms of a mental illness, like he says his psychiatrist at the time had done. I must admit, as a medical student first studying psychiatry, I was asking myself such questions. What exactly were these visions? Were they hallucinations? Were they part of some kind of diagnosable psychiatric illness? Was he becoming psychotic like his mother? Even then, I knew very well that diagnostic formulations of the visions might be good enough for psychiatry, but they could never be good enough for literature or religion. Alan knew this and urged me not to limit myself to diagnostic concerns and to consider the aesthetic and spiritual dimensions of the visions. So I read the 65 Paris Review interview and everything else I could find, both published and in Alan's archives. When we meet, Alan takes the time to tell me the story of the visions and to explain how he understood them. And the story he tells me is very similar to the descriptions I read in the interviews. He calls them my Blake visions and speaks of hearing Blake's voice reciting poems, deep and ancient, quote, just like my own voice sounds now, he says, speaking slowly so we can both hear its deep timbre. Sitting together in his apartment, I listened carefully to Alan's explanation of the Blake visions, as they came to be called by his biographers and critics. Alan was unrivaled at telling stories about himself, adding layers of nuance, literariness, and politics that inform and intrigue. At the time he gave the first of the interviews about the visions, the psychedelic era was just taking off. For Alan, talking about his personal experiences with visions was a deliberate effort to preach to the youth, public, government, anyone who would listen about the value of alternative forms of consciousness. The Blake visions he spoke of helped turn him into a qualified leader of the counterculture, whereby he recommended that others discover their own visions by any available means, including taking LSD. And he was still recommending LSD 20 years later when we speak about the visions, because he sees alternative states of consciousness not just as some fad or so equivalent to madness, but as an essential dimension of life, one in need of nurturing and understanding. But I take notice of how most published accounts of the visions are retrospective from many years later, and this seems important. And I think what we need to do is kind of understand contemporaneously how his accounting of these visions evolved. So let's go back in time to 1945, 46. Alan comes to Columbia campus as a 16-year-old freshman from Paterson, New Jersey, raised in a middle-class Jewish family. His dad's a poet and a high school teacher. His mom, well, she was a teacher too, but had other things going on. So at the time, as luck would have it, he meets these guys, William Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, Hal Chase, an unbelievable gathering of folks on Columbia College campus in New York City. And Kerouac and Ginsberg hatch a plan for the new vision. That's what they call it, the new vision. And they describe it as the need to take in the world as it is, without ordered, rational preconception, then create an entirely new order in consciousness, very much influenced by Rimbaud. And it was largely up to Kerouac and Ginsberg to write this new vision into reality. From where we sit today, we could say that they certainly delivered. Yeah, at the time, this is the summer of 1948, Alan was lonely, directionless, despondent, living by himself in an East Harlem apartment, subleased from his theology student friend. He was studying Cezanne for a paper he needed to complete for Professor Meyer Shapiro's art history course so he could graduate. He rode the Broadway subway down to look at Cezanne's lace stock painting at the Museum of Modern Art. For money, he worked at the Columbia University bookstore. He read Yeats, William Blake, St. John of the Cross, William James, and other visionary literature that he found on the shelves of his friend's apartment. When the visions came, they took him by surprise and immediately became his new reason for living. He told his father and friends, and even strangers in bars about them. Although the visions were difficult for Alan to describe, he tried his best in letters, journal entries, and poems. They were inspiring, empowering, but also terrifying. He wanted to tap into the spiritual and aesthetic power of his visions, a mission of central concern for the rest of his life. So he had the first glimmerings of a vision looking at this painting at MoMA. The next day, he's reading The Sick Rose, William James poem, and he has a full-on vision. He writes to his friends. He writes to Kerouac. I can't forget what I have seen, something dreamlike and white, ardennesque, ghostly about us. The unreal has become for me the most real now. To Neil Cassidy, I have had moments of absolute, valid, literal knowledge. I have seen the nightingale at last. Remarkable, but no mention of a voice. He writes poems about the visions. He wants to be able to capture the sense. He wants people to read these poems and have visions of their own. So one of the poems is 2 sonnets. This is just like one or 2 lines from it, but I'm going to read a little bit more of it to you. 2 sonnets. I dwelled in hell on earth to write this rhyme. I live in stillness now, in living flame. I witness heaven in unholy time. I room in the renowned city, am unknown. The fame I dwell in is not mine. I would not have it. Angels in the air serenade me, serenade my senses in delight. Intelligence of poets, saints, and fair characters converse with me all night. But all the streets are burning everywhere. The city is burning. These multitudes that climb her buildings. Their inferno is the same I scaled as a stupendous blazing stair. They vanish as I look into the light. He's claiming, like, I'm an eyewitness to the divine, despite this wicked city that I'm living in. I dwell, I see, believe. This was the visions. Now, the thing that happened to him is the more that he kept talking about these to himself, to his friends, to his family, the crazier he seemed, the more confused he seemed. His dad started to worry that he was becoming like his mother, and this was a symptom of mental illness. In his journal, he writes, I am ill. I have become spiritually or practically impotent in my madness this last month. I suddenly realized that my head is severed from my body. Alan was living with this character, Herbert Huncke, who some of you may know. He's a writer in the Beats world, but also a junkie and trying to support his habit, living with others. And Alan's living with them, and one day they are in their car driving around Upper West Side of Manhattan. A cop comes up behind them. A car chase ensues. The car turns over. Alan, who had his writings with him in the car, they fly all over 96th Street or whatever it was. They're lucky to be alive. It was a bad crash. It's kind of scandalous. It makes the New York Times. Columbia student embeds with junkie gang for material for his novel. This is a story. But it's a serious business. The others get charged with crime. Hunky goes to Rikers with the others. Alan's dad hires an attorney. The attorney has Jacques Barzan, the esteemed professor at Columbia, write a letter saying they should save Alan from such an unfortunate fate and restore him to his true potential. And so Alan, a deal is struck, and Alan is going to the New York State Psychiatric Institute. At the time, he was waiting around for the court to process this, and he and Jack Kerouac make light of the situation with this little ditty that they wrote together. All the doctors think I'm crazy. The truth is really that I'm lazy. I made visions to beguile them till they put me in the asylum. Funny stuff. But it was serious business. Serious business in part because of Alan's history. So this is Naomi and Louis in better days. Naomi came as an immigrant. This is Alan's parents. Naomi came as an immigrant child from the Russian Pale, landed in Lower East Side of Manhattan, stayed on Orchard Street. Family had a candy store. They were living in a kind of boarding house down there. And she then went to New Jersey, learned to become a teacher, had her first nervous breakdown when she was, I think, around 20. And then things got much worse several years later, and she's admitted to Cornell Psychiatric Hospital with psychotic symptoms. And this is a picture of her many years later outside of Pilgrim State Psychiatric Hospital, which we'll hear about in a moment. This is a remarkable picture. As part of a home movie that they shot. That's Alan's brother Eugene, who's visiting Naomi. This is actually a week before she dies at the hospital in 1956. Look at how unhappy she is. I want you to flash back to another moment. Well, actually no. Let me do this first. The world knows a lot about Naomi Ginsburg because of Alan's Kaddish. Have you read Kaddish? People are familiar with Kaddish. It's really spoken of as Alan's masterpiece. And Kaddish is a long poem. It takes 40 hours to read it. It's 36 pages. It's 4 parts. Alan wrote it in his flat on East 2nd Street in New York City. That's where he wrote the longest part of it. Other parts were written in Paris and somewhere else. Let me read a little bit of it. As I walked toward the Lower East Side, where you walked 50 years ago, little girl from Russia, eating the first poisonous tomatoes of America, frightened on the dock, then struggling in the crowds of Orchard Street towards what? Towards Newark, towards candy store, first homemade sodas of the century, hand-churned ice cream in back room on musty brown floorboards, toward education, marriage, nervous breakdown, operation, teaching school, and learning to be mad in a dream. What is this life? The poem is like an elegy for Naomi, for her life, and for her madness career, in great deal. And it really shows how kind of modernity nearly murdered a woman's soul and that of her family. Madness is really presented as a social diagnosis. She went mad because of fascism and communism and migration and disruption and nuclearism and all of these things that still go on today and that drive many people mad. So Kaddish really bore witness to a whole world so full of crises, trauma, and contradiction that it drove this innocent young immigrant woman who was his mother to madness. And it said things about madness that had never been said before, documenting, of course, its awful, destructive potential, but also finding their passion and love and spirit and insight. I think Kaddish is maybe the first and certainly one of the most compelling family first-person narratives of serious mental illness. And Kaddish has also taught several generations how to mourn ambiguous loss, how to mourn losses that are very, very complicated, not straightforward. And it shows open-heartedness towards a mentally ill loved one that in some ways is even more revolutionary than Howl, which shows a different kind of solidarity with madness. And in Kaddish, Alan declares that Naomi is his muse. And he says, "O glorious muse that bore me from the womb, gave suck first mystic life, and taught me talk and music, from whose pained head I first took vision." I first took vision. So back to the idea of his visions. So he lays that out there in Kaddish. So let's talk a little bit more about Naomi again. Well, no, actually, let's listen to this video right now. This is from Kaddish, a very small part of it that Alan read in 1995 at the Knitting Factory, shortly before, a couple years before he died.
Downward, no shock.
Sorry.
I turned it down.
You did?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
sorry about that.
This is from part 2 of Kaddish, a little bit.
Lost in Gracetown ward. No shock for her. Electricity, following the 40 insulin. And Metrosol had made her fat. So that a few years later, she came home again. We'd much advanced and planned. I waited for that day. My mother again to cook and play the piano, sing at mandolin, lung stew and stanka razum, and the communist line on the war with Finland, and Louis in debt, suspected to be poisoned money, mysterious capitalisms. I walked down the long front hall and looked at the furniture. She never remembered it all, some amnesia, examined the doilies, and the dining room set was sold, the mahogany table, 20 years love, gone to the junk man. We still had the piano and the book of Poe and the mandolin, though needed some string, dusty. She went to the bedroom to lay down in bed and ruminate or nap, hide. I went in with her, not leave her by herself, lay in bed next to her, shades pulled, dusky, late afternoon, Louis in front room at desk, waiting, perhaps boiling chicken for supper. Don't be afraid of me because I'm just coming back home from the mental hospital. I'm your mother. Poor love, lost, a fear. I lay there, said, I love you, Naomi, stiff next to her arm. I would have cried. Was this the comfortless lone union? Nervous, and she got up soon. Was she ever satisfied? And by herself sat on the new couch by the front windows, uneasy, cheek leaning on her hand, narrowing eye. At what fate that day, picking her tooth with her nail, lips formed an O, suspicion, thoughts old worn vagina, absent side glance of eye, some evil debt written in the wall, unpaid, and the aged breasts of Nurk come near. May have heard radio gossip through the wires in her head, controlled by 3 big sticks left in her back by gangsters in amnesia through the hospital, caused pain between her shoulders into her head. Roosevelt should know her case, she told me, afraid to kill her now that the government knew their names, traced back to Hitler, wanted to leave Louise' house forever. One night, sudden attack, her noise in the bathroom, like croaking up her soul, convulsions and red vomit coming out of her mouth, diarrhea water exploding from her behind, on all fours in the toilet, urine running between her legs, left retching on the tile floor, smeared with her black feces, unfainted. At 40, varicose, nude, fat, doomed, hiding outside the apartment door near the elevator, calling police, yelling for her girlfriend Rose to help. Once locked herself in with razor and iodine, could hear her cough in tears at the sink. Lou broke through the glass green painted door. We pulled her out to the bedroom. Then quiet for months that winter. Walks alone, nearby on Broadway, read Daily Worker, broke her arm, fell on icy street, began to scheme escape from cosmic financial murder plots. Now lost in Graceland.
Okay. So, on April 24th, 1947, a feeble 51-year-old Naomi Ginsburg entered the examining room at Bellevue Hospital in Lower Manhattan. She was teetering on her feet, almost falling over. I think that Alan had called the ambulance that brought her there to get evaluated. Sometime sitting there, she kind of jerked her head about on an imaginary axis drawn perpendicular to the floor. At other times, she flew her head under her chest and let it hang there. And she hung her head because she said, I can't keep trying to hold on to a happy thought. When asked about her husband, she said, that's where my trouble started. Everyone knows my life. It's a case in history. My husband killed his brother and child. My husband is a well-known poet. I left him 4 years ago. I got tired. We separated. His mother organized a gang to get something in America for the Jews. They went wild with the killing. She had visions of God. She said, all of a sudden, a vision came to me when I first became sick. It said, have patience. It comes to the needy. And I was so happy I tried to get him again. But she also felt like near life's end. I can't endure the suffering. I feel as though I'm dead, but I'm not dead. These things were very remarkable for me to find because I really wanted to discover Naomi. I wanted to know, can we get a sense of who this woman was? She's one of tens of thousands of people who were disappeared into state psychiatric hospitals with no hope of ever getting out. And we know her as a kind of icon of madness in Alan's cottage, but could we ever hear her voice directly? So it meant a lot to me to hear her voice here. Naomi went to Pilgrim State Psychiatric Hospital from Bellevue. That's a picture of Pilgrim State Hospital, which is on Long Island, about 100 miles from New York City. At the time, it was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world. 13,000 patients. 13,000 patients. Can you believe it? 1/5 of the world's, of the United States psychiatric inpatients were in New York State. And so a massive amount of people. Occasionally, Alan and his brother would come to visit, and Naomi says to the nurses, I feel sorry that they come and see this site. And another time, she goes up to the nurses, she says, there's no hope for me, I want to die, and she gives them a piece of paper requesting that they euthanize her. She writes letters to Alan, and this is from one of the letters, and it's a kind of epigraph of the book. For the love of Jesus, I do not know how I got this sickness. It's up to you to find out. Your loving mother, Naomi. In a way, he kind of did this, if you think about it. Here's what one of the letters actually looks like. Dear Alan and Eugene, please come to see me in a hurry. One son, call up the other son. Tell Eleanor, that's her sister, to come see me. I'm still alive and walking around. So desperate, so sad. This is from Naomi's psychiatric record at Pilgrim State. This is the chief of service, Dr. Henry Brill, saying that electroconvulsive therapy hadn't worked. She was still agitated. She was still depressed. And so they recommended prefrontal lobotomy. 1947. Alan had just gotten home from Dakar, where he was doing a merchant marine thing, comes home, finds this letter. Why does the letter go to him? At that time, Alan is the legal guardian for Naomi. Alan has been the caregiver for Naomi all these years as a child, okay? he lived with her. The parents divorced at some point, and Alan was very, very, very close to her. And so it was all on Alan. So I'll read the letter. Please be advised that your mother, Mrs. Naomi Ginsburg, was seen in consultation with the assistant director, and it was decided that her mental condition is serious enough to warrant a prefrontal lobotomy. If you are interested in more details in regard to this type of operation and its possible complications, you can discuss this problem with the doctor in charge of the case of your mother on the next visiting day. In the meantime, we are enclosing a permit for the operation, which you can sign and return to us if you so desire. Very truly yours, Harry J. Worthing, MD. Alan didn't know what to do, but he goes to the hospital and he talks to the doctor, and the doctor says to him, your mother's gonna die if you don't do this operation. Her head is going to literally explode. So you need to do this. And so he did what anybody would probably do. He signed it. Made the decision alone, didn't talk to anybody, did it, and came home that day and wrote in his journal, Alan, don't die. A month or so later, lobotomy is performed. Lobotomy makes wide sweeping incisions that cut the way that the prefrontal cortex makes connections with other brain areas. At the time, it's touted as the miracle operation of psychiatry, like open heart surgery. It's going to cure schizophrenia. It's going to empty the mental hospitals. It's going to return these people, most of whom are women, and there's a real gendered aspect to this, but it's going to return them to their families. They'll be docile. They can do things around the house. Well, that's not what happened with Naomi. In any case, I also want to mention that I was rummaging around his archives in the spring of 1987, and I found this letter. And it shocked me because at the time, there was no public knowledge that Alan had signed consent for lobotomy. And if you think about all the things we know about Alan, it just wouldn't have made any sense. And so that put me in a very difficult position of having to decide, should I show Alan the letter? And I did in his apartment one day, and I was very stressed out about it, but I showed it to him, and he said, that's a very extreme thing. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, because I had to do the signing for it, and he was unclear about when it was, and we established when it was. He insisted that it was in the 1950s, and I said it was in 1948. And he said, oh, then there must be some relation between that and my psychotic experience. And he used the word psychotic experience to describe it. He's talking about his visions. So this is something that I explore more in the book. But I want you to think about Alan's frame of mind at the time in 1948 when he's doing the signing. He was very much under the sway of Rimbaud, and Rimbaud writes, as I came down the impassable rivers, I felt no more the bargeman's guiding hands. There was a kind of welcoming of a crisis, because a crisis was going to separate them from bourgeois, middle class mentality, way of thinking, and bring them close to the real, bring them close to the truth. And so, in a way, for Alan, this became the crisis that would do that. And this is the mentality that preceded the visions. So, I want to read one little part before we get on to the next thing. So, as I came to understand the visions happens some 6 months after him signing the lobotomy consent, which I think is kind of a big deal. Why did the visions come 6 months after lobotomy and just before graduation? It's impossible to know for certain, but we do know his life circumstances that summer resembled what William James, the varieties of religious experience, described about candidates for conversion experiences. James wrote, "To get rid of anger, worry, fear, despair, or other undesirable affections, an opposite affection should overpoweringly break over us." At that point in his life, when he had visions, Alan was facing multiple crises. His severely ill mother remained at Pilgrim State Hospital following the lobotomy. He was nearly finished with college, but had found no solid work or career. He was single, gay, closeted, apart from his friends. He hadn't managed to fulfill the dream he had for himself as a writer. Then suddenly, with the visions, everything changed. They were a sensual experience of a spiritual visitation. They thrilled and frightened Alan. He basked in the delight of having made contact with the eternal. He was also terrified by the realization that so few people around him seemed to be oblivious, so many people around him seemed to be oblivious to an eternal presence. Few people knew what he now knew. The visions, which opened the doors to both heaven and hell, excited and frightened him like nothing else. And they enabled him to put poetry at the center of his life, and he wrote many poems. And he thought he was going to be a visionary poet, but then he found that the poems were still clouded by the lack of concrete sensual realism. He wasn't reaching the heights that he wanted to reach. He didn't really talk about the visions directly in relationship to his mother, but it doesn't seem a far stretch to think about how having visions presented him as a poet and as a son a way to reimagine his relationship with his seriously mentally ill and now lobotomized mother, who for years had had her own visions of God. Decades later, somebody wrote about Alan. Alan was looking for the truths his mother had gotten lost within. As a child, he was exposed to all these visions, her paranoid delusions, her voices, nudity, unpredictability, suicidality. She tried to win Alan to her side. They were very attached. He talked her down when she was, getting too agitated. He kind of lived within her delusional system. And she did have a lot of passion for politics, for religion, for philosophy, and he connected with her on all those things. In 1986, Alan showed me a draft footnote he had just written for a Hebrew translation of Kaddish, and it said, "Her suffering affected me so, driving me out of my skull, out of my mind," a vernacular phrase for disturb, "so that I looked for a permanent answer or response or place for expression in poetry, or looked for a permanent vision through and in poetry." And another way that I say it in the book is that Alan was kind of like schooling himself on the best visionary artists and saints that he could find. St. John of the Cross, William Blake, the likes of them. His mother was defeated by her visions. She ended up in the hospital. She ended up being lobotomized, which he felt incredibly guilty about. Alan instead was going to be their master. He was learning from other masters. He could handle his visions and harness their power. Naomi and her madness would be redeemed. But Alan ends up at the New York State Psychiatric Institute up on 168th Street in Upper Manhattan, a very different place than Pilgrim State Psychiatric Institute, though it's part of the same New York State mental health system, but it's kind of the jewel in the crown. And there's a collaboration with Columbia University, so it's really an elite research and training hospital, and it's where I went to medical school and where I was training to be a psychiatrist when all of this came down. So what happened when Alan went to PI? So Alan, Alan gave me access to his psychiatric records, so I read it and studied it, and we have those, and one chapter of the book goes into it in great detail. And I think it's just remarkable because here we have this brilliant guy at a critical moment in his development as a young man and as a poet, and we have the process notes from his psychotherapy in a time when they really took good notes, and name me another artist for whom we have such material. I can't think of one. But this is a jump back in time. We have to look through the lens of 1940s psychiatry and psychoanalysis, so they saw things differently. So here's the Rorschach, the results from the Rorschach. The patient is a brilliant but autistic schizophrenic, probably of the catatonic type, who has religious ecstasies and occasional agitated periods in which he can be destructive. He feels alternatively crushed by the world and in command of the world. His unconscious seems to be extremely conscious. What's that? So he gets admitted to the 5th floor, the so-called genius ward, where a lot of intelligent and artistic people are admitted who are struggling with psychosis, and they do psychotherapy with them. The director of that ward, the director of research at the hospital, is a psychiatrist named Dr. Paul Hoke. That's him. And at the time, he and another doctor had derived a new diagnosis in psychiatry that they call pseudoneurotic type schizophrenia. And this is a diagnosis not used anymore. But what it essentially referred to is people who at their core were psychotic, but were kind of defended by 3 kinds of systems of neurosis, anxiety, and sexuality, and just kind of like holding on. And some of them, the thought was, are gonna spiral and become openly psychotic, and others may keep it together. They thought Alan was one who was going to be full-on schizophrenic within a few years, not unlike his mother. But this was a serious condition, and Dr. Hope was actually doing psychosurgery on such patients, which means lobotomy. And in fact, they had studies comparing psychosurgery versus psychotherapy, if you can believe that. So Alan was in the group of patients who was considered for lobotomy. I got to meet one of his psychiatrists, actually was one of my teachers at the time, but was a resident back then. And he told me that he and the other residents would try to protect the patients from being selected for lobotomy, and that they had their eyes on Alan to try to protect him. Alan was in art therapy. He drew this painting looking out over Hudson River, the Palisades, and George Washington Bridge. This is what the progress notes look like, and many pages of these. But you can see there, he says, when he thought of a new vision of reality, the whole world had an intelligence running through it. So there he is talking about his visions with his therapist. So it's kind of remarkable. Well, I became a psychiatrist and a therapist, so I could understand these notes and analyze them appropriately. And in the book, I go through that in great detail, but not for professionals, for anybody who wants to understand how therapy works and how it might work in this case. So I'm going to share with you just a few vignettes from the therapy, and I'm going to test you a little bit too. Mary, I'm going to test you. See how you would respond. So, what if your patient comes in and says, "I'm the greatest poet of my age"?
I think so too.
Well, it's easy to say now, but at the time, he was not a published poet. He he was clearly brilliant, but people weren't sure what to think about him. So what should you say to him?
Good luck. See how you feel in here.
Here's some paper.
What is this? And what is this anyways? It's I think it's what we would call grandiosity. And a lot of people who struggle with psychosis or having psychotic breaks are very grandiose, and their grandiosity is out of control. And so one of the things that you try to do with such people is try to help them rein in their grandiosity a little bit. On the other hand, he could have been right. But you can't. But what are the doctors supposed to do? They can't predict the future. So as luck would have it, the therapist is writing down his notes, talking with Alan, he's writing down his notes, and then someone knocks on the door, and he has to walk out the door to talk to someone, and Alan kind of like peeks at the notes to see what the dude was writing, and he sees I'm the greatest book of my age, and he goes, that sounds pretty paranoid the way you have it there, doesn't it? And it was kind of like the best thing that therapist ever did, completely by accident, because it was a good interpretation of Alan's grandiosities, getting Alan to kind of step outside of that and take a look at that and see, is this really how it is, and how is this attitude serving you well? Here's another moment about the visions. The therapist writes, again, when it was suggested that the unusual intensity of experience may be a state in which his usual intellectualizing defenses were not operative, Alan was disappointed. He wanted these to be considered special and prophetic states. If the therapist didn't believe him that he saw a God, Alan threw a fit. But the therapists, they were tough. They weren't going to fall for that. They were like, okay, great. So what are you going to do with that? You want to be an artist. You're going to have to find a way to communicate that better than you have so far. So it's on you. I'm not going to get into the issue if you've seen God or not. All right, here's another thing about, he struggled a lot with what is madness, what is mental illness, obviously struggling with how to think about his mother too. He made it clear at the start that he looked upon mental illness as a definite entity, that for him, everyone in the world is sane or insane, and he's having a little trouble placing himself in this scheme. He described his vision, stating clearly that these are the experiences which previous therapists have labeled mad. So am I mad? What's madness? Is my mother mad? What's mental illness? He's trying to ask these questions, but he's approaching it from a fairly rigid and dichotomous point of view, which isn't serving him too well. He talks a lot about his mother. Alan then said his mother often exposed herself. At age 10, he remembered feeling tempted to look. He felt this was seduction and that she demanded husbandly responses from him. There's a lot of stuff like this. An imagined, he had an appendectomy when he was young. He imagined that the appendectomy, the surgeon's incision gave him a vagina. So he had this sense of kind of disturbance in body image, which he related to his interest in men. Now, at the time, it's important to say that homosexuality was viewed as only a symptom of mental illness. And that's the lens through which they looked at his homosexuality, his preference for men. But there was some, chink in the armor, I guess you might say. At one point, there's an interesting exchange where Alan says to his second therapist, I guess I want to be the Queen of May. She's calling him on his kind of flamboyance and outrageousness, his risk-taking, his testing of limits with his father. And she's like, does being homosexual mean you have to take the extreme social risks you have? And so remarkably, this woman, who I think might have been lesbian, but I'm not sure, I never spoke with her. She asked to meet with his dad. His dad says, Alan's homosexualism, he calls it, is so degrading to me. And I feel like it's my fault. I feel like I did something wrong. And she says, so no. She goes, he has an illness. He has a mental illness. This is a symptom of an illness. And just like any family member needs to tolerate the illnesses of their family member, you need to tolerate this. Okay, not exactly like setting him free to follow his dream, but actually in a way, bucking the orthodoxy of the day and helping Alan create a space with his father, that his father then allowed him to leave the hospital and come home. And, allowed him to work something out for a couple of years. Alan was extremely grateful for that. And to this day, well, when we spoke, was, really appreciative of what this woman did. And the day after she did that, Louis, Alan's dad, complained to the chief of the hospital and got her fired from the case. Because, he couldn't stand that. But he did stick by it. So Alan is at the end called pseudoneurotic type schizophrenic. As Alan says to me, they certified I was not mad, more of a real neurotic who was pseudopsychotic, you might say. And Alan liked it. Alan liked the idea. Alan loved his diagnosis. And I explained it to him. He said, because I like the idea that everybody lives near psychosis, and that I live near psychosis. That's true. That's how I think of myself. I'm going to keep going a little bit, if that's all right. What was Alan writing at the time? At the time in the hospital, he was obsessed with the idea of the shrouded stranger. And he wrote 3 or 4 notebooks of shrouded stranger poems. This was going to be like the big breakthrough work. Kerouac and he also were Kerouac was working on this too. It became Dr. Sachs, Kerouac's novel. And this is a drawing in Alan's notebook of this character, the shrouded stranger, and the different kinds of literary origins of it: Poe, Sachs, Faust, Kafka, Dr. Jekyll, that kind of thing. But the shrouded stranger is a kind of urban boogeyman, a scary creature. Who'll come lay down in the dark with me, belly to belly and knee to knee? Who'll look into my hooded eye? Who'll lay down under my darkened thigh? Like beckoning to a child along the railroad tracks. And his therapist thought that this was the best poem he had written at the time. In the inpatient unit, he interpreted it as, this is an image of your psychotic and seductive mother who was at the same time terrifying, but also deeply appealing to you as a child. Alan gets released. A week later, he goes to hear William Carlos Williams read at the Guggenheim Museum. Williams is from Paterson, New Jersey, of course, famous poet, pediatrician in New Jersey. And Alan asked if they could meet. They eventually meet some other day, and Williams says, "Show me your poems, let me see what you got." He looks at the poems, he says, "No, not good. You shouldn't be writing in kind of traditional rhymed verses. Let me see your notebooks." Looks in his journal. Says, Good. Take this, do some work with this. And he tells Alan what to do. Alan then writes this to Kerouac and as a kind of instruction for what they're going to do. It says, all you got to do is look over your notebooks. That's where I got these poems. Or lay down on a couch and think of anything that comes into your head, especially the miseries, or night thoughts when you can't sleep an hour before sleeping. Only get up and write it down. Then arrange in lines of 2, 3, 4 words each. Don't bother about sentences in lines of 2, 3, 4 each. We'll have a huge collected anthology of American kicks and mental usuries. And so this is what they do. So he goes into his journals and he comes up with these poems. And those are most of the poems that you know now as An Empty Mirror. He goes in another direction too. He starts what he calls the Stranger Project. This would be a good project for San Francisco, I would say. Alan goes around the streets, goes on the subway, looks for people who are obviously struggling, who are mentally ill or homeless, and drafts portraits of them. And this is a description of a woman, thin, bony, elite, passively mad, anciency or nobility, intelligence beyond ideas, completely beat, shifting nervously in her seat, continually agitated by her unknown mystery. So more attracted to like a kind of urban ethnography of people on the street, of people living lives of madness, than he is of the mythical character of the shrouded stranger. And he's drawing in his journal, and he's drawing this figure that he calls like person who is half skull and half alive, half dead, half alive. Man who sees death or is half dead. Man who knows death, who knows he will die. He knows he will die. He knows death. He knows he was born. He's playing around like, what does it mean to live a kind of double-sided existence where you're aware of death, you're half in death, you're half in life. And think about it. Alan led a double-sided existence his whole life with his mother, being on the brink of psychosis. I mean, in psychosis and on the brink of death, suicidality. He went, he would spend weekends riding the bus to Greystone Psychiatric Hospital or other hospitals to visit her. He was exposed to this whole world. And as a young man, coming on the scene in New York City, he was attracted to all people like people like junkies, people who were strung out, people who had mental health issues, people like Carl Solomon, who was the friend who we met at New York State Psychiatric Institute, who was a writer from the Bronx, but also struggled with mental illness. So he was interested in all these people and what was happening with them. He wrote a poem that had this line: many a soul gone riding outward on the path, many a soul gone to the jail and prison and asylum. And then one day, blocks from here, really, in North Beach, 1955, I think August 22nd, 1955, Alan is sitting down and doing what Williams told him to do: flip through your journal, look for the things you wrote in your journal, see what you can do with them. And he saw this line: I saw the best mind angel-headed hipsters damned. And that day, he took that line and he broke it into two. And he wrote, I saw the best minds of my generation, generation destroyed by madness. And then he put it back together into one line: I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. And that, of course, became the first line of Powell. And that opened up the floodgates. He hadn't been intending to write a poem, but then in a marathon writing session, he wrote Powell. And this is a wonderful statement, I think, this first line, because what is he saying? He's saying, I saw. He's not saying I was, he's saying I saw. He said, I'm a witness. I'm a witness to madness. I'm a witness to this thing called madness, whatever that is. Madness, is it good? Is it not good? I mean, it's the best minds, but is it the best minds meaning they're liberated, they see things that others don't see? Or is madness a consequence of being destroyed somehow, what society has done to them? Let's just say it's multi-positional and ambivalent, I would say. It's more liberating, much more liberating than not liberating, but it's a hard line to figure out. I think it embraces these things and these many different positions, and probably some others you could come up with. But it really demanded a response. It demanded that Alan then tell the whole story of his generation, of a generation of young people that thought they were brilliant, but were told that they were losers, and thought that they were, even when being crushed, seeing things about society that others didn't appreciate. And so he wrote that poem, and you know the poem. Maybe we'll listen to a few lines of it to see if it works.
How for Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who, poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from.
Okay, you get the idea. Hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war. That's him having his visions at Columbia. Who demanded sanity trials, accusing the radio of hypnotism. That's his mom. So I want you just to think for a minute, and I'm going to wrap up on it. How far Alan came from 1948, having the visions, to 1955, writing columns. Just 7 years, right? Just 7 years. But think of all the things that he managed to pull together in those years. One is that I think he learned to not take so many risks. Not aesthetically, he was taking a lot of risks aesthetically, but risks in his personal life, risks by hanging out with criminals and things like that, risks with his own flirting with suicidality. So he learned how to be safer. What else did he learn? He learned how not to be so possessive of his visions. He learned to kind of stand back from them. He learned not to say, I saw God, like I possess God. He learned to be more in the position of a witness, to seeing the struggle of people who think they saw God or have some experience of madness. And he grew to embrace this whole construct, this wonderful construct of madness as a kind of like, again, ambivalent, multi-positional thing that embraced everything from deviance to serious mental illness, to ecstasy, to sexual freedom, to artistic expression, and so on and so forth. And so for Alan, they were all lumped together as madness, and it was an essential property of life. He also learned how to restrain his grandiosity. And he really learned how to get work done as an artist. And he learned how to work out a deal with his dad about his homosexuality that would allow him to have a place to live and to do his writing. Well, so those were major achievements. I think that the therapy he had and the treatment he had deserves some credit, some small amount of credit for helping him to do that, as flawed as it was, and it was very flawed from today's perspective. So the last time I saw Alan, he asked me if I had gotten his mother's records, and at the time I hadn't. And I was actually terrified to get those records. But I did, so I got them after he died, and I found something remarkable in them that I'm sure he would have wanted to know, but I didn't know. Wasn't able to tell him because I didn't know at the time. That there was a record there from Naomi, from Naomi's first hospitalization, that Naomi had been sexually molested when she was 5, 6, 9 years old, living on Orchard Street. And think about that. It makes you think really differently about her diagnosis and her treatment. Not sure anything could have been done differently for her back then, but certainly would be if that were the case today, when we take trauma and trauma to children, sexual trauma very seriously, and we have systems of trauma-informed care. They weren't there then. But it also makes you think differently about the transgenerational transmission of trauma that was passed on to Alan. It makes you think differently about Kaddish, and it makes you think differently about that's in the story of Kaddish is a story of violence against women, not just madness per se. And so I think it makes it an even fuller picture. The other major gap there is that I'm going to end. I promise. That what's remarkable about the Psychiatric Institute records is that the lobotomy is barely mentioned. And never, ever, ever is it mentioned that Alan signed consent for his mother's lobotomy. So how is it possible? How is it possible that he goes for treatment at this elite psychiatric hospital? It's part of the same system, New York State mental health system, that lobotomizes his mother, but it's never mentioned. And I think that, Alan did a lot with these experiences and found a way to artistically work them and created the great art that we know that have liberated and uplifted many. But there was a lot that didn't happen, a lot of healing that didn't happen for him, and that was left with him for the rest of his life, and he was very unhappy about that. I got a chance to experience firsthand. But in the end, to learn from Alan is to accept that the bum's as holy as the seraphim, the madman is holy as you, my soul, are holy. To walk with Alan is to believe that the madness within us and around us is sacred and should be handled with care and reverence. Thank you. Sorry, I kind of got into it, so.
We're so happy you did. Thank you, Stevan. Such deep insights into Allen Ginsberg and his family relations, and particularly with his mother. And also just to understand more about his deep vulnerabilities and also his braveness and boldness and what he came from and where he went in his life, and all that he's given in this incredible poetry and work and relationships. So we want to open up for questions from you. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come over with a microphone.
So I'm curious about the language issue, because I know my grandparents came from Russia and didn't speak any English. And it had a really profound effect on my grandmother, who was subsequently incredibly isolated and deteriorated as a result. So my question is really about Naomi and whether was her first language English or Russian, and was, as an immigrant, maybe the isolation was conducive or was a cause of a breakdown.
Yeah, that's a great question. Her first language was Russian, and but she learned to speak English as a kid, and I don't think had any problems speaking English. I don't know. I did a lot of work with immigrants and refugees, and I think that you're right. Isolation can be a big problem, and some people are vulnerable to that. I guess, this is pure speculation, but I think that we always think about kind of the interaction between brain and environment, and including social environment and family environment and the wider kind of societal environment. And I think there's all that going on for Naomi. I can't help but think that there's some brain-based vulnerability in her, some biogenetic disposition towards psychosis. And in fact, there are several other people in the family in the extended family that have had such issues. I've come to understand. But I think that the issue of the sexual assault that she suffered is huge. And I mean, when I first saw that, I was speechless, because I think that more so than isolation per se. But in a way, that breeds its own kind of isolation, because of course that would never be talked about, and she had to live with those memories. And when you see the kinds of delusions she had, you can also see that she's working over some of those issues. There's kind of a imprint of sexual trauma in some of that. You know, in another day and age, maybe she would have gotten some kind of trauma-informed therapy and not gone down the road she went. I like to think that that we are in that other day and age in part because of Alan. Because Alan, the fundamental message of Kaddish and Powell is to humanize matters. You know, have sympathy for these people. You know, they're like us. We're like them, and talk with them and work with them and support them. And Alan was a great inspiration to R.D. Laing and the anti-psychiatrists. And Alan wasn't the anti-psychiatry, but I think that anti-psychiatrists were a great inspiration to persons with lived experience and the consumer movement and peer movement and all of that. So I think that in a way, Alan opened those doors with this. So in a way, Naomi did. So there's something satisfying about it if you think about it that way. But there's nothing satisfying about the fate of Naomi, who died alone in a concrete room in Pilgrim State Hospital.
Question here.
Yes, so Doctor, I was, wanted to ask you about the use of the word madness in the subtitle. Because you probably could have used the phrase mental illness or mentally ill or psychotic experience.
Right.
Could you say something about why you decided or chose to have the word madness in the subtitle?
Because I think that's, I think it's of value. I think it means something. It means something different than mental illness. I think madness, or even you could say simply unreason or something, is a big, big circle, okay? That contains within it all of those kinds of things I said before. Ecstasy, sexual freedom, deviance. It also includes mental illness. So it is not a romanticization. It has bad things and bad consequences, but I think this is the construct this is how Alan saw the world. This is the construct behind the poems of Kaddish and Howell and some other poems. And I think this is what spoke to the world. I think that it was a kind of lever that helped open things up in the culture, and that you know, said to people, well, you know, this kind of like tightly wound cultural space that we had post World War II in Eisenhower's America. There's more to it than that, and some of the folks that we're excluding and some of the thoughts and feelings that we're excluding are really shouldn't be excluded, should be cherished, and blah blah blah. And I think that that's what Alan latched onto. Alan was into both personal and social liberation, spiritual liberation, and I think madness captures that in a way that mental illness never would. But we should never forget that there is mental illness. Mental illness is real, and Alan was not, you know, taking the position of what's his name? No, the other anti-psychiatrist from New York State, Thomas Szasz. You know, the myth of mental illness. He was not taking that position. Alan was, you know, I think like Blake and other great artists, Alan saw at the same time the liberatory and degradatory potential of madness, and he saw both the injurious and the therapeutic potential of psychiatry, and he was trying to keep those all in one ball.
Questions?
Thank you for the talk. I was curious about how was it that you developed a connection with Allen Ginsberg so that he trusted you with these medical records?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I reached out to Alan when I was a third-year medical student. I had read his poetry since junior high school. I was deep into it. I was into Dylan and all of that. And, you know, Alan was almost as cool as Dylan. And so I wanted to, I wanted to become a psychiatrist. I was going to become a psychiatrist, and I was thinking about things like Howell and Kaddish from a literary and a psychiatric perspective. And I had questions that I couldn't answer. And then I realized he was an inpatient at the very place where I was then studying psychiatry. So I wrote him a letter. I sent it to his publisher. And 3 days later, I came home and there was a message on my answering machine from him saying, "Hi, Steve," and starting to tell me the story. He says, "Call me tomorrow." And I skipped class and I called him. And I spoke with a man named Bob Rosenthal, who's an important person I'll mention. I'll come back to in a second. And he's like, hands the phone to Alan. And Alan, you know, I introduced myself to Alan, and Alan's like, "Are you writing a book about me?" And I said, "Yes." And he's like, "Good. Meet me tomorrow at the Museum of Modern Art." And you know what I said? This is in the book. I said, "MoMA's not open tomorrow." Because I knew, because I was a student member. He said, "Don't worry, I'll get us in." Of course, you're Allen Ginsberg. So the point is that Bob, who was his personal secretary for 20 years, said that Alan had an incredible ability to read people. He could read people instantly, and he could make judgments about whether this is a good person and trustworthy or not. And he said, "Alan had a good feeling about you." And he said he was right. I think if I had been like the person I am now, he probably would have told me to piss off. I think because I was a student and I was open-minded, and I was clearly interested in literature and not just going to do a psychiatric number on him, he thought this was good. And I was a student at Columbia, and he cared about Columbia. So, and the fact is, I wanted things, but he wanted things too. What did he want? Well, just to be clear, he didn't want to sleep with me. That was never a thing. And we were connecting on a different level. He wanted to know what had happened to his mother. He wanted to know what was going on with her. Did she really need the lobotomy? Should I have signed that? What happened to me at the Psychiatric Institute? Alan had told so many kind of myths about his life that, he couldn't find his way back at that point, and he wanted someone to help him to look at the records and tell the truth of the story. Not in a way that erased, his achievements as an artist, which I think are amazing, but complicates things in a way, such as the vision. So back to the vision. The truth is that Alan didn't report hearing the voice of William Blake until 17 years after the actual Blake visions. Well, not exactly 17. There was some things here. I know here, like in 1958, he wrote a poem that he said, and dreamed of Blake's voice talking, something like that. So maybe at least 10 or 12 years after. So what's going on there? Does it mean Alan was lying? No, it doesn't mean Alan was lying. Alan was doing the work of an artist, and the visions were material, and the visions weren't just a thing that happened one day. The visions were subject to artistic reworking. And Alan struggled with how do I represent this experience in a way that could be understandable. And one thing that helped him was seeing Fra Angelico's Annunciation, which gave him the Annunciation gave him a model, gave him an artistic model for what a vision would be. This is the voice coming down, like Madonna, like the angel Gabriel and Madonna. So when he told the story of himself to the world, he never really mentioned the lobotomy. I mean, it's there. But he also says, "Oh, mother, what have I left out? Oh, mother, what have I forgotten?" Well, maybe what he left out was, that you signed consent for lobotomy. She never knew that you did that. You never told people. I think this tortured him. He lived with that all of his life. So these were the kinds of things that were on his mind. He was trying to find some peace. He was, he did great artwork. As I said, it inspired lots of people, but he himself was never healed from this. It was painful for him and for those around him. Yes.
Question here.
So, I mean, clearly, many people experience madness or mental illness do not create great art, but Allen Ginsberg did. And just stepping back a bit, have you given much thought about how much of the great art we appreciate is created by those experiencing madness or mental illness? And given your professional background.
Yeah, well, I mean, sure, that's something I've thought about, and a lot of people have thought about that. I mean, I don't think that this is like I would never say that all art has to be created that way. There's so many different kinds of art and paths to art. And, but I think for sure, in the case of Allen, he worked with all of this life experience. I would never say even that something like Kaddish is a documentary in the way that it is. There's no obligation in Allen's art for it to be completely honest and truthful to life. And Allen made modifications to make the art better, even in things like Kaddish, and I point those things out in the book. But I think for lots of people, yes. But I want to make the point one that Allen didn't turn to art to make himself feel better. It's not like he was sad and he wrote poems to uplift himself. The opposite. I mean, Allen hurled himself into a lot of pain, and in a way went to the madhouse in order to walk the steps that Naomi walked and to own that experience, own the visions, let it. I mean, he took a lot of risks, and so this was not like art to heal your wounds. This was art that wounded, and I think there are a lot of artists who do that. I don't know. I'm a big music fan. I just read Warren Zane's book about Nebraska, Bruce Springsteen's album Nebraska, where he's, which is kind of Bruce's revisiting of childhood trauma. I think there's a lot of trauma in the beats. There's a lot of trauma in Burroughs, in Kerouac, in others that we don't know as well, in Diane DePrima or Bob Rosenthal, and so not Bob Rosenthal, Bob Kaufman. So I think it's something worth thinking about. But then I also don't think that there's any simple formula for transforming trauma into art. But I think that there's great value in doing a close study, like what I did of Ginsberg, for other artists, and see if you can trace those paths in a way that makes sense. And the related question, okay, Laura, but the related question to that is, that someone is asking for is, if he had gotten proper treatment, would we have the art? What if he had gotten trauma-informed care? What if he took Cymbalta? My answer to that is, I think not, because it would have messed with the brew, the brew that he was so immersed in, that he was working with. And but on the other hand, the trauma, the therapy that he got, I think saved his life and helped him stabilize his life in a way that he could get artistic work done. So, it's kind of gray area. Yes.
Grant me one last quick question and answer, because we want to have time for you to sign books.
Yes.
Well, there's a film biography of Ginsberg, and in it he says that his last letter from his mother,
Yes.
she said to him, the key is in the window.
Right.
The key is in the sunlight in the window.
Right.
And that is poetry. And I'm wondering whether you think she had the gift of poetry too, if she could have, put everything under control and into art.
Well, yes, I think that she did have a way with words. And you can see that in some of the letters. You can also see that in a short story she wrote. I found a short story amongst her papers at the Pilgrim State Psychiatric Hospital, which is kind of remarkable. But I think that persons who are struggling with psychosis and with trauma, there's often a kind of poesy to their words, to some of their words. If you spend time with people with serious mental illness, some of their language can be very poetic and evocative, and then the next sentence is incredibly mundane. And so, I mean, one of the things we've done, in therapy with patients is to poetry therapy. I've done poetry therapy with people with psychosis and help them to be able to express themselves. And I think there's great value in that. And I think Alan would be all for that kind of thing. And I think Alan was inspired by his mother's words. And I think he was tortured by the fact that he had lobotomized her, because he took that away. She was much worse after lobotomy than she was before. And the last letter is not the last letter. I found that out, and I talked about that in the book. He made a swap. That letter was a previous letter that had been sent to his brother Eugene, but Alan loved it for the image. The key is in the sunlight in the window, there's a lot of the image of the sunlight recurs a lot in Alan's work and in the Annunciation and things like that. So Alan liked that. So he said that was the last letter. So that's an example where he took poetic license. But it's okay.
Dr. Stevan Weine, I'd like to thank you for this very powerful conversation about Allen Ginsberg, shedding some light on Allen Ginsberg's work and his life. And also, he's such a literary giant in America, and around the world. So thank you so much for your book. Please purchase books and have them signed. Thank you for joining us.
Fantastic. Good. I did it one this way. Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I